A loaded line does not forgive a slow decision. Bram came out of the dark at the freshwater dock with a wet black rope in his mouth and dropped it into Rena Slate's open hand. It landed with a dull slap on the pale planks. Salt crystals broke loose from the fibers and skittered across boards that should have smelled only of lake water, mud, algae, and old wood. Rena did not look at the trainees first. She looked at the rope. Slick black line, gritty under her thumb, cold as if it had been pulled through deeper water than Greywake Training Lake owned. Bram stood at her knee, still, collar tags ticking once as he breathed. His eyes stayed past her shoulder toward the reed line. Rena slid 2 fingers under his collar and tightened down. The rope left a narrow black wet mark across her sleeve. She pulled a rubber reward from her belt and offered it low. Bram sniffed once, then turned his muzzle away. The boards gave a small answering shiver under her boots. Not enough to throw anyone. Enough to make the air change. "Back from the edge," she said. Nobody moved fast enough. They never did the first time. The pump shed sat dark beyond the service side, a block of old machinery and bad timing. Greywake was supposed to be quiet before the lane opened. Quiet had rules. This was not quiet. Tilda Venn had been half-turned toward the lane board, checking the night drill roster with the grim concentration of someone still trying to be useful before anyone asked. To her credit, she did not ask what Rena saw. She put both hands out and started shoving trainees away from the dock edge, repeating the order under her breath like she was pinning it to herself. Back from the edge, back from the edge. A kid in a flotation vest started to say the rope might be from maintenance. Rena lifted the black line higher. More salt flaked off and stuck to the wet cuff of her sleeve. Freshwater does not leave this on rope. That shut him up. The issued training line sat in its crate 10 feet away, bright orange, dry on top, labeled and boring in the way safe gear was supposed to be boring. Bram shifted his front paws, not toward Rena, not toward the reward on the boards, but toward the reeds. Not scared, not excited, still on task. That was worse than barking. She had seen bad gear passed off as harmless before. It always arrived with a shrug first and a report later. The hidden line moved before Rena could call the lane cold. It went tight under the dock with a hard little pull that traveled through the planks and into her knees. A cleat 3 feet away groaned like a joint taking weight. The floating dock shifted sideways, not far, just enough to make one trainee stumble against Tilda's arm. Rena dropped her hand from Bram's collar to the lead and braced. Off the dock, now. This time they moved. Wet soles slapped wood. Someone cursed softly. The black rope in Rena's hand was not loose trash and not old contamination. Old junk did not pull back. Old junk did not load a cleat. She felt the line take another pulse, then go still, as if whoever had it on the other end had realized the dock had answered. Tilda looked from the black rope to the issued line near the safety crate. Her face tightened. "Our line isn't black," she said. "And it's not salt-crusted." Rena nodded once. Good. One clean fact. The world could still manage those when cornered. The small pause after proof was always the dangerous part, when people understood trouble but still wanted it assigned elsewhere. Beyond the reed shadow, a low boat light winked, where no drill craft was scheduled to run. It held for half a second, thin and yellow, then cut out. The wake came after it, late and angled, slapping the dock float from a direction the lane map did not allow. Bram leaned into the lead without pulling, body aimed at the reeds, reward still ignored behind him. Rena felt the pump cycle more than heard it, a faint working tremor under Greywake's old wood, too early and too steady for a lane-marked stable. Permission would come with questions, channels, call signs, and someone wanting a clean reason. The rope was already reason enough. The throat was somewhere beyond the service side, dark and narrow, and the line under her boots had just reminded her it was active. Rena kept the black rope in her left hand, Bram in her right, and looked past Tilda toward the place where the light had died. "Find Hale's position," she said. "If he's off that safety post, I want to know why before the water tells us worse." The trainees were behind Tilda now, breathing hard, their jokes gone. That helped. Panic was loud. Silence listened. The dock did not settle after the light went out. It kept a small, uneasy motion under Rena's boots, the kind of floating platform made when something out of sight had passed too close and too low. The black rope lay looped across her left forearm now, wet and gritty, salt still working loose in white specks. Bram stayed at her right knee, not pulling, not settling either. His nose worked the air above the water, then dropped toward the seam where the dock met shadow. He bracketed the edge with his body and stopped just short of the line zone, which told Rena more than any bark would have. He had pressure, not a clean trail. The wake slapped the float again, wrong for the drill lane, wrong for the little safety skiffs tied off beyond the boathouse. A boat had moved behind the reeds and killed its light. Whoever had done it knew enough to be quiet late, not quiet first. That was a human mistake. Rena kept her hand low on Bram's lead and watched the reed tops bend in the dark. The pump shed stayed out of sight, but the dock carried small messages through its boards. Hale should be on the outer safety post, Tilda said. She had one hand on a trainee's shoulder and the other on a low blue edge light she had pulled from the crate. Her voice stayed steady, but her eyes had started counting empty places. Rena followed her look. The outer post showed a clipped safety flag, a dark rail, and nobody standing beside it. Hale Merritt did not wander off post during night water. He cut corners, he joked when cornered, and he could make a bad shortcut sound like weather, but he did not leave a live lane blind unless something had taken the choice away or he had made a worse one first. An empty post on night water was not a staffing error. It was a blind edge. It meant the lane had lost the pair of eyes meant to catch the thing nobody else saw until too late. Rena did not give that thought room to grow teeth. "Mark the dock edge," she told Tilda. "Blue lights only. Keep them low. Nobody steps past you unless I say." Tilda nodded once and moved, repeating it softly. "Blue lights. Low. Nobody past me." She set the first light down near the planks, not high enough to mark faces, only feet. Good. Fear that obeyed was still useful. The trainees watched her now instead of the water. Better, but only barely. Tilda did not need courage that looked good. She needed courage that worked. Rena keyed her radio, heard 3 channels step over one another, and killed the transmit before her thumb finished the press. Too much chatter. Too close. If someone was moving through the reed side, an open call would warn him before it helped her. She switched to the short sideband and kept it clipped. "Control. Hold trainees off dock 2. Medical standby near the north lot. No full shutdown yet. Keep chatter off the open water channel." A voice started asking why. Rena had already lowered the radio. Formal help existed. It just moved like formal help, meaning it arrived with questions wearing boots. By then, a line could move, a body could slip, a boat could vanish behind reeds and become everybody's later problem. Bram's ears shifted toward the reeds. A thin clack came from the outer post, not metal breaking, more like something tapping once against a rail. Rena crouched, one hand close to Bram's collar, and saw it under the safety flag, a short black wrap tied around the bottom rung, flattened by wet fingers. It had been placed for someone looking down instead of out. Hale had left a cue where a route reader might catch it. The marker was ugly and small. That made it his. No flourish, no message, no heroic little breadcrumb. Just a waterman's signal aimed at a person who knew to read rail and water together. The wrap angled toward the reed channel, not the boathouse, not the main dock lane. Rena touched it once. Diesel came off on her glove, fresher than the rope salt. Diesel, black wrap, dead light, and a wake from the wrong direction all leaned toward the same service side answer. Bram smelled the rung, then lifted his head toward the reeds. At the same moment, a dark shape shifted low behind them. Not a bird. Too square. Too deliberate. The safety lights on the dock smeared blue across wet boards as Tilda finished her line, making a narrow strip of honest ground behind them. Beyond that strip, Greywake had become reeds, black water, and bad choices. Rena stood. The pump hum came up through the dock, soft but different, a lower note under the lake noise, like old machinery clearing its throat. Bram heard it too. His weight changed. Rena kept him close and looked toward the dead boat light. Hale was missing. The line had moved. The hum had changed. That was enough to move before proof got neater. The pump hum rose through the dock after the dead boat light, low enough to feel before it became sound. Rena kept Bram close and moved off the marked edge toward the maintenance angle, where the planks narrowed and the blue safety lights behind her turned wet boards into a strip of bad glass. The black rope still hung across her arm. Salt grit dried white at the bends. Bram nosed once at the rope, then turned away from it, unhappy with the air. The scent line had started to break. Water did that. Diesel did it better. Pump draw made it worse, pulling little scraps of smell down and sideways until even a good dog had to sort lies from movement. Rena watched the waterline first. The wet mark sat high against the dock post, a dark ring above the current edge. Not much. Enough. She looked back once and saw a little more post showing than she had seen from the dock edge. Mud shone where water had covered it minutes before. The dock was not rising. The lake edge was leaving. At Greywake, small water changes usually had a machine behind them or a lie, or both. The dock gave another soft shift under her heel. Behind her, one trainee whispered a question and got shushed hard by Tilda. That helped more than loose panic. Vern came out from the maintenance side with a handlight pointed at the boards, not at faces. That was the first useful thing about him. He was broad through the shoulders, damp at the cuffs, and already listening past Rena to the pump shed as if the machine had insulted him personally. "That hum's wrong," he said. Rena did not ask him for a history of the place. "One fact," she said. "Now." Vern looked at the post, then at the water. His jaw moved once. The water lines should not be dropping during the drill. He took 2 steps down, put his hand on the rail, and stopped there. If the edge is falling, the service channel is awake. Tilda, 10 yards back, kept the trainees behind her blue lights, every low marker making the dock smaller and safer at the same time. She heard enough. Her face went still in the useful way. Rena liked facts that could be carried in one breath. She hated the ones that arrived late. The hum thickened under Vern's boots. His light trembled just a little across the wet post. Mud at the lower step had a fresh shine, as if the lake had been pulled away from it minutes ago. "Shut it down," someone called from behind Tilda. A trainee, scared enough to make policy sound simple. Vern gave a hard laugh with no humor in it. "Stopping that pump now is not a switch." Rena watched Bram's ears flick toward the reed channel. "Say it smaller." Vern swallowed the rest of whatever lecture wanted out. "Delay," he said. "And if something's in the throat, wrong timing can make it worse." That was enough. A machine did not become safe because a frightened voice gave it an order. A body or object near the throat would make timing matter in ways nobody standing dry on a dock wanted to hear. Rena keyed the short sight band and kept her voice flat. Control. Keep medical standby north. Hold dock 2 cold. No open water chatter. No full stop until Vern is on the panel and I say it. The answer came back broken by channel noise and somebody talking over somebody else. She killed it. The pump draw was active, the stop would not be clean, and the crew behind that dead light was moving while everyone else tried to make the problem official. Beyond the reeds, something knocked once against wood or hull and then went quiet. A line shifted, or a hand lost grip and found it again. Controlled movement. That mattered. Bram leaned forward, then checked himself at Rena's hand. Good dog, bad air. His body pointed reed side, but his nose kept losing the thread and finding it again in short pieces. Not a trail. Pressure. Rena shortened the lead, not to hold him back from work, just to keep him from buying the next answer with his feet before she understood the shape of the risk. Hale's black wrap sat behind them on the rail, like an answer that had not finished speaking. The angle of it still pointed toward the reed channel. Not Boathouse. Not main lane. Service side. Behind Rena, Tilda held the trainees at the blue-lit dock line. Vern stayed planted near the maintenance angle with his hand light, and one hard fact. Rena and Bram were the only ones moving toward the reeds. That was not ideal. It was just what remained. She felt the pump through the soles of her boots, steady now, working under the water with patient force. Tilda, she said, without turning. Keep the lights where they are. Nobody follows unless I call. Copy, Tilda said, too quickly, then steadier. Nobody follows. Rena moved first. Bram went with her, head low, shoulders tight, scent breaking and catching as mud, algae, diesel, and old water pulled the path apart. The reed line waded ahead, black and close, and something inside it shifted deeper when they came. The reed line took the pump hum and made it meaner. Out on the dock, the sound had been a low warning through wood. In the reeds, it became a vibration under mud, under black water, under every stem that scraped Rena's sleeves as she moved in behind Bram. The dog worked with his head low and his shoulders tight, not fast, not clean. The scent broke apart in pieces. Salt came off the rope on Rena's arm. Diesel hung low at the water. Algae and mud sat thick enough to taste. A little wind pushed through the reed heads and shoved the air sideways, just enough to keep the truth from staying put. Bram caught pressure, lost it, caught it again. Rena let him work, then checked him short when he tried to drive too hard into the mud shelf. Easy, she said. Not soft. Just close. His front paws hit the wet edge, slid, corrected. On the next step, his left front set down short. Small change. Real change. Rena saw it and took a little pace off him. She did not stop to inspect the paw. There was no dry ground, no still clock, no clean room for care. She adjusted the lead and made the work smaller. A working dog could spend himself before a human admitted the ground was ugly. She had seen that, too. Behind her, Tilda's blue lights turned the dock into a dim safety line that already felt too far away. Vern stayed near the maintenance angle, a darker block by the rail, finished for now except for the one fact he had given, which was enough. The water line was falling. The service channel had current in it now. Ahead, the reeds bent low in a pattern Rena did not like. Not wind. Wind brushed the tops. This had gone through the lower stalks and left them snapped wet at knee height. Fibers clung to two broken stems, pale in the hand light when Rena angled it down. Not rope fiber. Cloth, maybe. She did not make it more than that yet. Bram nosed the spot and gave a short, hard breath, then moved right. His body chose the channel edge, but the scent made him work for every foot. Twice he stopped at diesel pockets that went nowhere. Once he circled a muddy hollow and came out with his muzzle wet, irritated, the way he got when odor had been dragged through water and pulled away. No answer. Movement. Rena could live with movement. Answers got people lazy. A scrape came from deeper in the reeds, followed by the small slap of water against something flat. Rena froze with Bram. So did the reeds around them, which told her the sound had not come from the lake settling. A shape moved beyond the next bend, not visible enough for a face, too steady for driftwood. The crew behind the dead light was not waiting to be found. They were changing angle, pulling deeper toward the old service route, while she wasted seconds turning sign into certainty. Bram surged one step. Rena checked him and felt him favor the left front again when he set it down. Grit had worked into the pad, or a reed had opened skin. Small cost, but it shortened the search window just the same. She crouched, touched his shoulder, then the ground in front of him. "Short work," she said. "Give me enough." Bram looked past her hand, reward forgetful, pressure bound. Good. Not perfect. Good was harder to use and easier to trust. Rena scanned low again and found the drag mark where the reeds stopped pretending. It was broad, smeared deep, and too heavy for a pod housing by itself. One edge had a hard scrape in it. Beside that, the mud showed a softer pull, the kind fabric and human weight made when dragged badly and in a hurry. The smear ran through mud and vanished under black water, then reappeared near a stand of reeds bent toward the boathouse. A small strip of black wrap had been snagged on a broken stem there, the same rough material as Hale's marker from the outer post, but torn instead of tied. Torn meant movement. Tied meant message. The difference was simple enough to carry under stress. Hale had come this way, or been close enough to leave proof that he still had hands free for bad little signals. No speech. No rescue flare. Just another cue from a man who knew better than to make noise when someone was listening for it. Rena took it and did not forgive him with it. Not yet. Bram sniffed the torn wrap, then lifted his head toward the boathouse. The odor changed there, thickening with diesel and salt, stronger than it had any right to be if the source was still moving. That bothered her. Strong smell was a trap for tired handlers and eager dogs. The pump hum rolled under the reeds again. Somewhere ahead, something heavy shifted, then stopped. Rena looked at the dark box of the boathouse beyond the stalks, then down at Bram's shortened stance. The next place wanted to look obvious. Obvious could still get people killed. The boathouse odor hit before the building did. Diesel, salt, wet nylon, all of it held low under the roof for Bram. He stopped hard at the locker row, just inside the open service door, front feet set, head angled toward the lower vents. No bark. No drama. His body went square and honest, the way it did when odor made a claim. Rena felt the old relief try to get in, small and dangerous. A source. Something fixed. Something she could put a hand on. The boathouse boards creaked under her boots, dry in the center and damp only where she had tracked mud in from the reeds. Bram nosed the bottom of the third locker and gave a short breath. Rena lifted the latch with 2 fingers and swung it open. The smell thickened. Salt. Diesel. Rope. Her first red settled too fast, and she hated herself a second later for how good that had felt. "Hold," she told Bram, and he held, weight forward, paw still shortened, doing exactly the job in front of him. The locker was dry. not mostly dry. Dry in the wrong ways. No fresh drip at the back seam. No wet mass on the floor. No black rope coiled inside. No pod housing. No body-shaped pressure against the thin metal wall. A folded tarp sat on the bottom shelf, stiff with old grime, and the smell around it was louder than the thing itself. Rena touched the locker floor and brought her fingers back clean, except for dust and old oil. Outside, beyond the boathouse wall, the pump hum changed pitch under the boards. Lower. Working. She looked at Bram. He was still on odor, still true to what he had found. The mistake was not his. It had come from her wanting the smell to mean, stop here. Worse, she had wanted that while his paw was already shortening and the pump was still drawing water down. She had spent part of his working window on the wrong meaning, and the math of that landed colder than guilt. Tilda appeared in the doorway behind her, breathing hard from the reed line but staying out of Bram's space. She looked once at the locker, then at the wet trail outside. "There's no water in there," she said. "Good. One useful blade." Rena closed the locker without slamming it. The strong smell had pooled here. That was all. Wrong place, right odor. A nasty little lesson, and late. A scrape traveled through the boathouse wall from the lakeside, not inside the room. It moved away as Rena stood still, which made the price plain enough to taste. Ward's crew had used the delay. They had dragged something past the wall while the odor sat fat and obedient in the locker. They had counted on Bram being accurate and Rena being human. That worked often enough to make a profession out of it, apparently. Bram shifted toward the rear service door, then checked his weight as his left front foot touched down short again. Rena tightened the lead before he could spend more of himself on her mistake. "No," she said, and meant herself as much as him. Tilda's hand went to the frame, ready to ask if they had found it. She did not ask. The empty locker had answered. Rena moved to the back slit window and saw a low shape cut across the waterline shadow between the boathouse and the service dock. No light. No panic. Just controlled movement, worse than panic. The pump thudded under the floor again. Something heavy bumped once, softer than metal and too dull for a hard case alone, then slid out of earshot. Rena took the black wrap from her pocket and held it next to the stale odor trapped in the room. Same direction, wrong resting place. The route had not stopped at the locker. It had passed close enough to make the room lie. "Tilda, blue light on the rear edge," Rena said. "Low, do not step past it." Tilda moved at once, a little pale now, but moving. Rena reset Bram with a hand under the collar and turned him away from the locker before he argued with the smell. He gave her one hard look that was not human speech and did not need to be. He had found odor. She had found meaning badly. Fine. Correct it while there was still ground left to lose. A dull thump came from the dock service side, followed by a short order in a man's voice, too clipped to carry words. Ward, or one of his people, blocking the next line before she reached it. Rena stepped out of the boathouse into colder air. The wet trail ran toward the service dock, not back into the room. She had burned minutes on a dry locker while the route moved. Bram had paid for some of them. Now, the edge would collect the rest. The service dock answered before Rena reached it. A loaded line snapped tight across the wet planks, low and ugly, cutting the clean path from the boathouse to the service edge. It was not just a barrier. It was placement. One man near the cleat, one near the service post. Ward cast half a step behind both of them, with his weight quiet and ready. The pod housing sat behind the post on the high side, half hidden by a tarp corner and two boots. Ward put one hand out toward it, without looking back, a small command for his crew to keep the object moving first. Rena had the boathouse behind her, the service edge ahead, Tilda coming up from the rear, and the loaded line between all of them and the only useful path. They had not blocked the whole dock. They had blocked the part that mattered. The wet boards shone under Tilda's blue light. The pump hummed through the wood. Bram felt the line before he looked at the men. He lowered his head, set his front feet, and stopped with his bad paw just light enough for Rena to feel the cost through the lead. "Hold," she said. Bram held. Ward watched the dog, then Rena's hand at the collar, and understood there would be no stupid lunge to exploit. "Back up," he said. No theater. No raised voice. Just a man who had taken the lane and expected everyone else to notice late. Tilda came in too fast behind Rena and nearly gave Ward his first gift. Her boot slid on the slick plank edge, her shoulder pitching toward the line zone as the man by the cleat shifted the angle a few inches. Rena caught Tilda by the back of the vest and yanked her down and away hard enough to make the girl hit one knee. The loaded line hummed where Tilda's chest would have been. First ground lost. Ward's crew used it. The man by the post stepped wider, closing the service edge, while Rena had one hand on Tilda and one under Bram's collar. "Light left," Rena said. "Low, behind me." Tilda's face had gone white, but her hands moved. She dragged the blue marker back across the boards and set it where safe footing ended. Bram pressed forward half a step, boundary pressure, not attack, not magic, and Rena checked him before the bad paw had to pay more. Ward's eyes flicked to the paw. Practical. Cold. Rena hated that he saw it. He was not guessing at fear. He was counting what could still move. The second loss came when Rena stepped to cut off the post side man. The dock punished the angle. Her boot slipped, her bruised hip hit the rail, and Ward's shoulder came in at the same time. Not a swing, not a showy strike, just a hard body claim for the space. Rena took it on the rail instead of letting it drive Tilda backward. Her breath went out. Bram surged under the collar, muscles shaking, with the command he had not broken. "Boundary," Rena said, teeth tight around the word. Bram planted between Rena and the loaded path, tired body doing a clean job in a dirty place. The man behind Ward dragged something low behind the service post. Rena heard the difference under the pump. Scrape, pause, soft weight, scrape. Not a hard case alone. Then came the wet cough, small and swallowed fast, followed by cloth sliding over plank grain. Tilda heard it too, and froze with one hand, still on the blue light. Ward moved his shoulder to block the gap, but not before Rena caught a strip of soaked gray fabric and the sag of something that bent wrong for metal. The line angle changed again, tightening the dock into a smaller room. Ward's crew did it without shouting, working pressure, footing, and timing like they had rehearsed the ugliness, if not this exact night. Rena did not win the space. She kept Bram from spending himself. She kept Tilda behind the marker. That was what counted while the dock narrowed under them. Past Ward's shoulder, the wet cloth shifted, and a pale hand showed once against the planks before being dragged out of sight. Human weight. Cold water. A living man caught inside a root built for objects. Ward gave one short order, and the loaded line eased, then pulled in a new direction toward the service channel gap. "Housing first," he said to the man on the high side, almost too low to hear. His men moved with it, taking the hard object and the breathing shape away from the boathouse. Rena pushed off the rail, cheek wet with blood where her teeth had clipped it, and tasted diesel in the air. She had lost ground twice. She had not lost the truth. Whatever Ward was moving was not only pod housing, and whatever breathed inside that wet fabric needed out before the pump throat finished counting. The service channel gap took the line and pulled it out of sight. Rena went after it with her hips still hot from the rail and blood drying inside her mouth. Bram stayed tight on her right, limping only when the ground got uneven, which meant the limp was real, and he was hiding the rest because work had him. The pump hum ran under the channel wall now, rougher than before. Water slapped concrete where it should have been resting. Ahead, the wet cloth shifted again, dragged low between two moving shadows. Bram's nose lifted, then snapped down toward the planks, where water had spilled from whatever Ward's crew had pulled past them. He did not follow the black line this time. He followed the human part of it. Rena saw the change in his back before she saw the sign. Different pressure. More careful. Not rope. Not gear. A smear of cold water crossed the service boards, too broad for a hard case. One handprint, pale with mud, opened and blurred near the edge. Tilda made a small sound behind her and swallowed it. Good. The channel did not need more noise. Bram stopped at the handprint and breathed once, hard through his nose. Rena felt the old clues lock ugly into place. Heavy drag. No wet mass in the locker. Wet cough at the dock. The route was not carrying only evidence. Ward's crew split at the channel bend. One man pulled a hard black shape under his arm, compact and angular, the damaged pod housing by the look of it, though Rena did not waste breath naming it out loud. The casing mattered because it could prove the hidden channel had been active, and that someone had tried to move equipment through Greywake where no equipment should have been. Ward stayed with the low, dragged weight for 3 steps, then looked toward the man with the housing and pointed him deeper along the concrete edge. Object, one way. Person, the other. That told Rena enough. The shape under the soaked cloth moved wrong for equipment. A shoulder came clear. Then a face, gray in the low light, jaw knocking once with cold. The man tried to speak and got a broken breath instead. His vest had a torn contractor patch half peeled from the chest. Hask showed in white letters, and below it, a first initial smeared, almost gone. Lyle Hask. Living witness, not cargo. His right hand tried once to grip the concrete, missed, and scraped 2 fingernails white against grit. Cold water had taken the middle out of him. His eyes opened without finding Rena. His hand lifted 2 inches and pointed toward the channel mouth before dropping again. Pod, he said, or pump, or maybe neither. The word came apart in his mouth. Rena crouched just long enough to touch his shoulder through wet fabric. Cold. Too cold. Moving him mattered before treating him did. A shape came in hard from Rena's left and grabbed the rail before falling into the channel edge. Hale Merritt. Wet to the ribs, breathing like he had borrowed air from someone less stubborn, one sleeve dark and clinging at the shoulder. He did not look at Rena first. He looked at the falling water line, then at the wake curling through the service gap. That was Hale. Shame second. Water first. They found the old cut-through, he said. I left the service closure temporary after the last flood repair. It should have held. His face tightened as he moved, not from confession, from pain and the water under his boots. It didn't. Rena caught his arm for half a second, felt him shake, then let go because the channel did not care about reunion etiquette. You opened it for them? Tilda asked, young enough to want the word simple. Hale shook his head once, hard. No, I failed to kill it. That was not betrayal. That was worse in the adult way. A shortcut, with a receipt. Ward shouted something from ahead, short and flat. His man with the pod housing vanished behind the concrete bend, while Ward's other man dragged Lyle toward the narrowing approach. Ward was splitting the damage. Evidence away. Witness into pressure. Hale pushed off the rail. If they make the throat before the drop finishes, the channel does the rest. Rena looked at the pod path, then at Lyle's hand dragging uselessly over wet concrete. The object mattered. It explained the accident, the night movement, Ward's calm, Hale's bad shortcut turned into a route. Fine. It could matter later if there was a person left to tell anyone what it meant. Person first, she said. No ceremony. No moral music. Just the only order that still had blood in it. Bram leaned toward Lyle and checked himself when Rena tightened the lead. His paw cost showed now, small but steady, each set down a fraction short. She could not use him like a full-strength search dog anymore. She could use him like Bram. Boundary, direction, pressure. Hale moved beside her, favoring the bad shoulder, already reading the water. Left edge will fall faster, he said. Stay high on the service lip. Rena nodded once. Tilda came up behind them with the blue marker clenched in one hand, face pale but working. Behind them, Vern's voice cracked over the short band, half swallowed by static. The pump pitch dropped again. The water line slid lower against the concrete, showing old slime and a darker mouth ahead. Rena pushed into motion before proof could get any cleaner, with Hale limping beside her, Bram tight and tired, Tilda keeping light low behind them, and Lyle disappearing around the bend toward the pump throat. The water line dropped while they moved. It did not fall fast enough to look dramatic, which made it worse. It slid down the concrete in a steady dark scrape, exposing a wet band of old slime and rust stains along the service channel wall. Ward was ahead, Lyle was low near the pull, the pod housing was moving high against the concrete, and Rena's damaged team was behind all of it. Bram held her right side. Hale worked the lip on her left. Tilda came last with the blue lights. That was the map, poor as it was, and it changed every few steps as the waterline kept giving up ground. Ward was not running, not wasting breath, pushing his people toward the pump throat with the confidence of a man who had counted this route before. Lyle's soaked shoulder appeared once beyond the bend, dragged low, then vanished behind Ward's moving shadow. Rena felt the bruised place at her hip each time her boot found uneven ground. She kept the pain where it belonged, below the work. Bram tried to take the front, nose lifting toward Lyle's cold trail, then stumbled short on the bad paw when the concrete dipped. Rena checked him back. No full search, she said, more to herself than anyone else. Bram could not give her the whole route now. He could give pressure, edge, warning, boundary. That would have to be enough, which was a sentence people said right before the ground corrected them. Hale took the service lip, with one hand skimming the wall, bad shoulder tight against his body. He looked half-wrecked and still useful, in exactly the wrong way. His eyes kept going to the water, then to the angle of the wake bouncing off the concrete. He's cutting inside the draw, Hale said. Not the clean side. He wants the object through first, then the body, if the line holds. Rena did not ask him how he knew. Hale read water like other men read faces, and tonight faces had done nothing but waste her time. Can you beat him to the throat? She asked. No. Honest and ugly. Can you get me the safer edge? He nodded once. That was enough. Tilda came up behind, with two low blue lights clipped to her vest and one in her hand, moving more carefully now after the dock nearly took her. She set the first light low against the service lip without being told twice. It marked a strip of wet concrete that might hold a boot if the boot behaved. Keep them low, Rena said. If Ward sees the pattern, he uses it. Tilda's mouth tightened. Then I make him see the wrong one. Rena almost smiled. Almost. The girl was learning in miserable weather, as tradition demanded. Vern's voice came over the short band again, chopped by static and the pump. Edge is still falling. I can slow the panel response, not stop the draw clean. One fact. Still enough. Do not chase it, Rena said. Hold people back. She lowered the radio before he could explain what machinery already felt like under her boots. Lyle made a sound ahead, thin and broken, not a word. Cold water had stolen the shape of language from him, but not the need. Rena saw his hand slap once against concrete around the bend, fingers clawing for anything that was not moving. Ward's man jerked him forward. The pod housing knocked against the wall somewhere beyond, a hard, hollow strike, separate from Lyle's soft drag. Ward checked that sound first, not Lyle's breath. Object before witness. There it was again. Rena made her choice, and kept making it with every step. Bram, boundary, she said, as the service path narrowed. Bram moved to her right, head low, body between Rena and the drop when the concrete tilted. He was tired enough that the command cost him, but he held it. Not magic. Work. Rena shortened his lead until the leather cut warm against her palm. Hale gave a sharp hand signal without stopping. Wake, rebound, slick turn, bad footing. She read the shape, not the gesture. Move high. Stay out of the pull. Keep Lyle in sight. The pump throat showed itself by sound before shape. The hum compressed there, hard and close, tucked inside a concrete choke where the service channel narrowed between two wet walls. Low light from Tilda's markers slid across the ground and died at the edge of black water. Ward's crew reached the throat first. One man shoved the pod housing toward the high side. Ward stayed near Lyle, one hand on the loaded line that ran through the mess like a bad decision made physical. The line lifted from the wet concrete and went tight across the approach. It did not snap this time. It rose with purpose, making a gate out of pressure. Bram stopped before Rena told him, body set, paw trembling. Hale came up beside her, breathing hard, eyes fixed on the line angle and the water curling below it. That line loads again. It takes the space, he said. Noted, Rena said. She could feel Tilda behind her, lowering the last blue light at the edge, giving them just enough ground to see the mistake before stepping into it. Lyle's head turned toward them, eyes unfocused, lips blue-gray. Ward looked back once, practical and cold, and pulled the root tighter. The pump throat waited behind him, loud enough now to eat every soft sound. The pump throat compressed every sound until even breath came back flattened. Water slapped inside the concrete choke, hard and close, while the loaded line lifted from the wet floor and vibrated across the approach. It ran from Ward's hand to the floor and back into the dark water, humming each time the draw took another pull. Tilda's light shook behind Rena but stayed low. Ward had the space first. He used it well. Lyle lay low at the throat edge, half-turned, one leg caught under soaked cloth. The pod housing was 3 yards higher on the concrete strip, black casing dented and slick under early light. Ward stood between them, one hand on the loaded line, his crewman at the pod, Rena facing him from the approach, with Bram on her right, Hale on her left, and Tilda behind, with blue light in her fist. That was the whole ugly room. Lyle's mouth was blue-gray. His eyes opened, failed to hold Rena, and slid toward the sound instead. Slow response. Breath present. Cold confusion before collapse. Rena took that in, without kneeling into the pull. Full treatment could wait until the place stopped trying to eat him. Person first, she said. Tilda, mark the live edge. Hale, read the line. Bram, boundary. The pod mattered. It was proof of Ward's night, and Hale's failed closure. It could sit there on wet concrete and be meaningful later. Lyle could not. Ward took more space before the order finished landing. He hauled the line toward the high side and made the approach smaller, forcing Rena's team toward the water-polished strip where footing had already started to lie. Bram stepped into boundary on Rena's right, head low, bad paw trembling with each set down. He was exhausted enough to show it now. Still he held, body between Rena and the worst angle, no lunge, no animal miracle, just work under cost. Hale moved on, Rena's left with his bad shoulder clamped tight and his eyes fixed on the line's lift. "He's using the rebound," Hale said. His voice had gone thin, pain taking the edges off it. "If he loads it again, it sweeps the lip," the quote. "Can you buy me a breath?" Rena asked. Hale looked at the water curling under the concrete throat. Not at Ward. Not at the pod. One ugly one. He shifted forward and put his weight where the line wanted to take space. Not a technique. A price. The line jumped. Hale went down against the concrete, shoulder first, the impact flat enough to make Tilda flinch even before he made a sound. That ugly breath was enough. Tilda slid her blue marker across the wet floor, low and quick, not to light the safest path, but to make Ward's man trust the wrong strip for half a step. The blue edge landed just beyond the wet shine, close enough to look like footing and far enough to lie. It did not save anyone by itself. It made one man believe the concrete would hold him. The man carrying the pod housing shifted his boot onto the slick band. His weight went bad. The pod hit concrete with a hollow crack and skidded into open light. Ward reached for the housing and Lyle's line pressure at the same time, trying to keep object and witness inside the same narrow throat. Greed would be too simple a word. It was control under strain, and control finally ran out of room. Rena did not cross the line. She denied it. She drove Bram's boundary left with knee and lead, kept him clear of the loaded path, and used Hale's bot second to reach Lyle's shoulder. Cold water hit her wrists. Lyle's breath hitched, weak but there. She pulled him just far enough to clear the line's worst bite. The loaded line rebounded off the wet concrete lip Hale had read and cut sideways across Ward's own route. Ward's boot went out from under him. His shoulder struck the wall. The line pinned the space he had meant to own, and the pump throat took his clean exit away. Rena stopped moving the moment Lyle had air and distance. Not safe. Safer. That was the honest word. Anything cleaner would have been a lie. "Hold him high," she told Tilda. Tilda dropped beside Lyle with both hands in soaked fabric, shaking and still useful. Bram stayed planted between Ward and the bodies, panting hard, bad paw lifted now that the command no longer hid it. Rena shifted one hand to his collar and felt the tremor there, not fear, just spent work. Hale rolled onto his side, one arm locked across the injured shoulder, teeth bared against the pain. "Temporary closure," he said, staring at the line instead of Rena. "My call. No confession. No plea. Just ownership paid in bone." Ward tried to rise and found the route had failed him before any badge arrived. When the first voices from Dock 2 reached the throat, they came after the work was done. Early daylight thinned Greywake from black to gray. Lyle breathed in short, ugly pulls, alive and nowhere near fine. The pod housing lay exposed under Tilda's blue light. Rena stood wet, bruised, cold, cheek split, one hand still on Bram's collar. Greywake had witnesses now. Nobody there could pretend the line had ever been harmless. It would have questions. The line dripped between them, emptied of force but not of truth.